Tonight, on this edition of John Ankerberg, is astrology a true or false practice? This is an important question since 40 million Americans believe in some form of astrology, and over 1 billion people in the world look to astrology for help in guiding their lives. Recently, it was learned that astrology has influenced even the highest levels of our national government, the White House, and as you will hear, also influences our industry, the sciences, education, the church, and the home. John's 5 guests tonight will be astrologer Maxine Taylor, First Vice President of the American Federation of Astrologers and the author of 5 astrological texts. Astrologer Terry Warnicki, past President of the Arizona Society of Astrologers, who holds a Master of Science degree in astronomy. Karen Winterburn, former professional astrologer for 12 years, who, because of research and personal events, quit her profession and renounced her belief in astrology. Dr. John Weldon, an authority on comparative religions and author of numerous books on the cults and the occult. He holds degrees in sociology, divinity, Christian apologetics, and comparative religions. Dr. Walter Martin, the founder and director of the Christian Research Institute in California. He is the author of the classic best-selling volume, The Kingdom of the Cults. We invite you to hear this program and be sure to stay tuned to learn how you may receive your own free copy of the brand new Anchor book entitled The Facts on Astrology. This book, written by John Ankerberg and Dr. John Weldon, answers such questions as, what is astrology? Do the heavens really influence life on Earth? What are the dangers of astrology? Does the scientific evidence prove or disprove astrology? And what does the Bible say about astrology? We invite you to join us for this edition of John Ankerberg.
We're glad that you joined us tonight, and our topic is, what is the relationship of astrology to Christianity? Is astrology credible? And you can see from May 23rd, People magazine had a big article on this, and of course when Nancy Reagan talked about her relationship with her astrologer in California, this also made news in Time magazine. And tonight we have some people that know this topic, and we're glad that you've joined us. And I'm going to come to Miss Maxine Taylor first, the first Vice President of the American Federation of Astrologers and a practicing astrologer in Atlanta. And I'd like to ask you, Maxine, we're glad that you're here first of all. We'd like to ask you just to define terms. What is astrology?
Well, astrology, as I see it, because each astrologer will define it a little bit differently, just as you know, everyone can interpret things differently. The study of astrology is the study of the relationship between God and man. And because each astrologer interprets it differently, to show you that there is room for all type of thought in astrology, you might be interested in hearing Terry's definition of astrology.
Okay, Terry, what's your definition of astrology?
Well, mine would be a great deal different, of course, because of the scientific background, and I would construct a sort of scientific definition that would go something like, astrology is a holistic or spatially oriented science that studies the effects of major astronomical-sized objects, usually within the solar system, in terms of their effects upon specifically located entities and events on or near the Earth's surface.
Dr. Martin, astrology is a belief system based on assumptions, and primarily that the stars, the planets, the sun, somehow they are mysteriously influencing the lives of men. And there are 40 million Americans that are said to dabble in astrology. And of all things, the Gallup poll just came out and said that 10% of evangelical Christians embrace astrology. You don't. Tell us why you object to astrology with all of these people, and with our friend sitting right next to you. Why is it that you object to astrology?
Do we have a half hour?
No, we don't. Briefly.
To briefly sum it up, I would have to say that my reservations about astrology are based upon its origins its association with polytheism, and the fact that what you're really getting is an analysis of the characteristics of the gods when they are discussing the various signs of the zodiac. This can easily be demonstrated, has been for a number of years. Actually, the Oxford English Dictionary gives an excellent definition of this. It says that astrology is the art of judging the occult influences of the stars upon human affairs. And this is where astrology has always been coming from as far as the Christian church is concerned and Judaism is concerned. There's nothing to be said good about astrology in the Old Testament that's connected with polytheism and paganism. And I think if we're going to deal with it honestly from a Judeo-Christian perspective, and this is a country which espouses that perspective, the United States, then I think it'd be a good idea for Western civilization to take a good look at the origin of it and not be misled by the fact that scientific information and other things are brought in an attempt to establish it. Biblically speaking, it's not compatible with Christianity.
Terry, you're shaking your head like you disagree there. Let's go back to your definition here. Would you agree that astrology is saying that there is a connection between the whole universe? It's interconnected, and that somehow that what is happening in the planets is happening in men. It's influencing men. Was that how you'd put it?
Yes, absolutely. And I certainly would hope that we would be misled by the things that modern science has accomplished. To say that, or to suggest that there's no connection between astrology and Christianity or the Judeo-Christian tradition is simply ludicrous. There are statements, for example, if you take one in the Bible, in Luke 21, chapter 21, 25, when the apostles asked Christ how they will know when the time of the end is near, he answers to them, there'll be great signs or great portents in the sun, the moon, and the stars that tell you when the time is near. Now, there's an example of Christ using astrology, but not only that, he's even recommending to his apostles that they use this technique to tell about something to happen in the future.
Do you really believe that Jesus Christ would use something that's condemned by Moses in the Old Testament?
I don't believe it's condemned by Moses in the Old Testament.
Dr. Martin, what do you think?
Well, that's ludicrous. First of all, the context of Luke 21 is talking about the end of the ages. There'll be signs in the sun and the moon. Then he describes them. The moon will be turned to blood. The sun will be darkened. That's your signs. He's not talking astrology. He's talking about, you can look up at the terrestrial heavens and you can see this. You know immediately that this is nearing the time of the end. Jesus Christ was a rabbi, number one. 2, he was an Orthodox rabbi. 3, he said that the greatest of all the authority that we could turn to was the Word of God. He said that Moses wrote of him, and he backed up what Moses said in fulfilling his prophecies. He was the Messiah, the Redeemer of the world. He had all the knowledge necessary to inform us if astrology was good. So did the apostles. They didn't. In fact, they backed up Moses in the Old Testament, where God lists astrology in Deuteronomy chapter 18 as under his curse, specifically. Now, I don't know whether you're familiar with the Hebrew or not, but I have both Hebrew and English here tonight. Deuteronomy chapter 18, when thou hast entered into the land which the Lord thy God gives thee, there shall not be found in the midst of you anybody who practices divination, astrology, and astrology is essentially divination. The person who's casting a horoscope is saying, I can tell you something through the stars about you, your times, and the future. I can do that through this information. That is biblical definition of divination and the dictionary definition. Quote, the act or practice of foreseeing or foretelling future works or describing hidden knowledge. The art or practice of trying to foretell the future of the unknown by occult means, close quote. Now, you qualify in the Hebrew language and in the Greek language for occultist. You qualify for condemnation under the law of Moses. Now, I believe that astrologers are sincere because there's obviously power there, and they've tapped into it, and if it's real for them, it's right. But from a Christian perspective, it can be real and satanic, and that's the church's perspective.
What do you think? Yes.
John, I'd like to jump in here. I'm sorry for laughing. I know that you're very sincere in what you're saying. Years ago, when I first became involved in astrology, I went to a minister, a priest, and a rabbi, because I was very concerned about what I might be doing, particularly so since I've been involved in the legalization of the practice of astrology in Atlanta. And when I went to the rabbi, since you brought up the Jewish heritage, I'll never forget this. I went to his study, and he had a book, just like you see in old time, huge book, black book. He dusted it off. It was covered with dust. And he opened it up and dusted it off, and I thought, this is like in a movie. And he started translating, because I don't read Hebrew. And what he was translating was the definition, as I had studied it, of the planet Saturn. And he was going, well, he was going this way, actually. I go this way, but he was reading in Hebrew, right to left. And I said, what book is that you're reading? And he said, this is from the Kabbalah, which is the mystical, the spiritual book that only rabbis are permitted to use. This is taught to them in what they call the yeshiva, where the rabbis study. This is not given out to the common people. He said, this is the basis of the spiritual interpretation of Judaism. And then he asked me if I would do his horoscope. Now, in Judaism, I understand, they have, just as in Catholicism and just as in Christianity, a division. There are those people who are for it, and there are those people who are against it. When I saw that rabbi reading from this book, it blew me away. And then when he asked me to do his horoscope, I said, now, is this contrary to your religion? And this rabbi said, absolutely not, and quoted Rabbi Ben Akiva. Now, I don't know who Rabbi Ben Akiva is, but this man is a learned rabbi, and I take his word that it is not against Judaism.
Walter?
Forgive me for laughing. The Kabbalah is cursed by Orthodox Judaism. The Hasidic on it because they say it's blasphemy. The Old Testament wants nothing to do with it. And if he did that in Jerusalem, they'd stone him to death if he could get out alive.
Doctor, let me ask you.
Now let me finish. You can say whatever you want, but let me finish. The Kabbalah is a cursed tradition, condemned by the Old Testament, condemned by the New Testament, and by the Christian Church. The fact that the rabbi told you that, I know immediately he's not an Orthodox rabbi.
He is an Orthodox rabbi.
Then he would be unfrocked if they knew it.
We're going to take a break, and we're going to come right back here, and I want to talk to our other two guests as well here. And we have a lady that's been a practicing astrologer for 12 years, and I'd like to ask her a question. We'll come right back. Karen, I want to come to you. You were a practicing astrologer for 12 years in the city of Chicago. You have broken down the definition of astrology into three groups. You think there are three kinds of astrologers that you saw as a practicing astrologer. Tell us what you were talking about.
Well, when I got into astrology, I was a skeptic, and I was challenged to just try it and see if it works. And I did, and it worked immediately. And so I delved into the study of it, and with one goal in mind, and that was to find out why it works, because it does work. And the farther along I got in study, the more people at the sort of, shall we say, upper echelons that I met in my area, the more it became clear that astrology that is done well is done in an altered state of consciousness. There are three levels of astrology, how to do astrology, and this was kind of common knowledge, not something perhaps you'd share with the client, but something that we all understood among ourselves, that there is psychic astrology, there's intuitive astrology, and there's bad astrology. Bad astrology is serve it up right out of the cookbook. Computer can do it, or you can do it, and let the chips fall where they may. You don't have to ask the person anything, you don't have to get to know them, you don't have to psych yourself up or anything. Intuitive astrology, you don't need to be psychic for. Sometimes these two overlap, but not necessarily. Intuitive astrology, I meet the person, I converse with the person, find out kind of where they're at, what their concerns are, you know. Is it relationships, is it finances, is it education, a goal in life, what's the story? And the more I talk with that person and look at their chart, when I have their chart in front of me, I have hundreds of indicators. Some of which, you know, they all say and indicate different things. Some of them are mutually exclusive and contradictory, and others are supporting, self-supporting, or mutually supporting within that system. And so I can pull out any one of those or any combination of those that refer to what that person, where that person's at right now. And I can begin to read the chart of that person and deal with that person's character and possible options in life on the basis of that. I can ignore the ones that seem contradictory. Those are inoperative in the person's life right now, I say. Then there's psychic astrology. This is where it's at. This is where the dramatic successes are in astrology. This is where every astrologer I have ever known who has had dramatic successes say it has led. And that Psychic astrology is a matter of you get your information about the person's character, about the person's future, about the person's options, however you want to phrase it, from either your higher self, your God self, your Christ self, your spirit guides, discarnate entities, however you want to phrase it. There's an intermediary there. You do not get it from the information before you. That is simply to prime the pump. That is simply to give you something to talk about. It's a framework which you use verbally when you're communicating with the client.
Dr. Weldon, you actually went out to the American Federation of Astrologers where Maxine was speaking, I believe, as well as you listened to the other lectures that were out there, and you've written your book in light of what was said. Where did you feel that the emphasis was for the astrologers?
Well, the emphasis clearly was on the side of astrology being an occult practice. I talked with approximately 50 astrologers and interviewed about 10 among those 50 in some depth. I took 9 courses, and 8 of the 9 professional astrologers admitted to having spirit guides or to being influenced by spiritism. I examined approximately 300 of the 500 books that were on sale in their book tables, quite briefly. Without one exception, there was occult philosophy, at least to some degree, in all of them. And as far as I can see, what we're dealing with here is my objection to astrology is that it is, in essence, an occult system. Historically, it has been accepted as an occult practice. Today, many astrologers accept that it is an occult practice. Most objective independent scholars tie it into the occult. I think that the basic power in astrology, where the genuine self-disclosures or revelations come from, is ultimately spiritistic. In fact, a number of former astrologers admit to this. Charles Stromer, in his book, for example, What Your Horoscope Doesn't Tell You, says that after 7 years as a practicing astrologer, his conclusion was this was where the real power came from. Almost every other person I talked to at the American Federation of Astrologers conference, it seemed, was into spirit guides. You have a number of other corroborating lines of evidence to indicate that astrology is not a science. It is an occult practice, and the reason for concern is that the occult is something that's very dangerous. I've studied the occult for 15 years, and I've written a 400-page text on the hazards of psychic and occult involvement. Today, most people do not know that they're getting involved in something occult because it's given a different name. And astrology is one of the easiest ways to get involved in the world of the occult. Indeed, almost all occultists, except astrology.
I need a definition. What do you mean occult?
To me, I define the occult as involvement with demonic supernaturalism.
Astrology is not occult in that case. There is no demon, there is no supernatural. And John, you didn't interview me at the AFA because I would not have said that.
Nor me. Nor did you ever have any classes for me.
Nor
I might point out, this, I guess, also includes the category of Kepler, Copernicus, Tycho Brahe, Galileo, and Newton. Now, if you don't believe me that they are all practicing astrologers, read it in their own words. Go to the library where they tell you that astrology is a true science. My background is not Christianity, it's science.
And if your background is science, how do you explain the fact that for 1,500 years the astrologers were casting their horoscopes based on a geocentric universe of Ptolemy and nothing to do with the heliocentric universe which Copernicus demolished with one paper?
Well,
now, if you're a scientist, you know perfectly well that Copernicus annihilated... Well, wait a minute. If you're a scientist, you know that Copernicus demolished Ptolemy, didn't he?
No, he actually, well, the Greeks, no, the Greeks were quite aware that the sun was the center of the solar system. Ptolemy changed that for a while. All Copernicus did was bring that back. If you read that particular essay that Copernicus wrote, you'll find that he writes a preface to the Pope in that, saying that this is not my idea. It was original Greek idea.
Are you saying that their views were correct then, before Copernicus?
No, what I'm saying is that we have a man over here who's trying to speak about astronomy, and he knows nothing of astronomy. I am an astronomer.
Whoa, just a minute now. I didn't claim to be an astronomer.
Well, then you
claimed to be a theologian before. You quoted Jesus Christ and you knew nothing about it.
Your point is
all I said, yes, well taken. My point with you is that I'm quoting the fact, a scientific fact, that Ptolemy's concept of the world and astrology based on it was demolished by Copernicus. Is that or is that not true?
I would say that's true, yes.
That's all I said.
Okay, now
And therefore I do know something about it, don't I?
let me explain what that has to do.
I do know something about it.
You know something of it.
Thank you very much.
You don't say a little knowledge is dangerous. Let me explain what's going on there. An astrological chart is erected from the Earth, not because we believe the Earth is at the center of the universe. The point is that it's a map of the sky from the place and time that a person's born. And since all people have been born on the Earth up to this point, the map has to be made from there. So the fact that astrological charts were done before they were aware that the sun was at the center actually made no difference on the astrological interpretation, simply because of the fact that you're drawing a map from Earth. As long as they got the sun in the right spot, it would have the same effect as far as astrology
Terry, before we close, we've got just a few minutes left. Let me ask you a question about what astrologers do. The cardinal signs, Aries, Cancer, Libra, Capricorn, are supposed to be active. This is according to Womack's 12 signs, his book on 12 signs. The fixed signs, Taurus, Leo, Scorpio, and Aquarius, are settled. They stand fast. The mutable signs, Gemini, Virgo, Sagittarius, Pisces, are agreeable. They are flexible. I want to know who told the astrologers that information.
That's a very good question. First of all, you're doing sun sign astrology, which is not really scientific
So you
astrology.
don't believe in sun sign astrology. All the
No, I
astrologers
really
out there
don't.
that are practicing that in the newspapers, we should fight those
As a
guys.
matter of fact, astrologers frequently debate over whether the publicity that you get from the newspapers outweighs all the difficulties it creates by giving people...
Okay, Maxine, would you agree
On what?
that sun sign astrology is out in the newspapers? We should
No,
throw
I
that
would
out?
not. No, I would not. I have the same view that Terry does. I feel that the public is interested in astrology, and if that's the only information that we can deal with, if that's the only way that we can explain it, no, it is not true astrology, but it's better than nothing.
Well, wait a minute. Is it dangerous then?
No, it is not dangerous.
You're just giving false information then.
No, I'm not giving false information, or they're not giving false information. You're giving a particum of information.
You're dividing the entire world into 12 categories. Which
So then,
is
Terry, you
obviously not
would
sufficient.
say it's okay to use that?
Well, as I said, it's a great debate. I don't really, sometimes I feel that it is, if it's done very well. The point to keep in mind is that it's not right or wrong, but it's a tremendous generalization.
Let's get into that next week, and I hope that you'll join us, because I think it'll be an interesting discussion. Welcome. I'm sure you've seen many of the magazines. Time people have talked about what's happening in this country concerning astrology, and we wanted to look into this. Is astrology credible? Why is it that so many people are dabbling? They say 40 million Americans dabble in astrology. Maybe you do. Does it have a good foundation? Is it really scientific? Is it part of the occult? These are all questions that we're asking tonight. Does it have a relationship to Christianity? If so, what is it? If not, why? And I want to come this week, folks, to this area of what astrology is actually based on. If there is supposed to be some relationship between the planets, the stars, the sun, the heavenly bodies, and that which takes place on Earth. Different astrologers define this differently, and you're able to define it any way that you want to. I want to know, on the basic definitions of what the signs mean, and what the effect is, and how it's supposed to affect people, where did astrologers get that information? In other words, how does an astrologer know what characteristics a person born under a certain sign should have? Who told you? Terry, start us off.
Well, first of all, astrology has been studied in every major civilization on the planet for at least 5,000 or 6,000 years. I mean every major civilization. So what's going on here is there's a tremendous wealth of data. There is more data as to what particular bodies do when they're in certain places in the sky than there is data in physics or astronomy or any other field.
Hasn't that data conflicted? I mean, the Chinese horoscope and the zodiac were different than the one in Europe.
No, not at all.
They had certain signs that you didn't have in Europe.
No, not at all. Not necessarily at all.
Well, they didn't have the rat in Europe.
No. What you're talking about is the signs they use for each year in Chinese astrology.
No, that was part of their zodiac in China.
But they also use, what you see is they popularize in the press the part of Oriental astrology that's not done in Western astrology, but every part that's done in Western astrology is also done in the Oriental astrology too.
But I'm saying, okay, we've got that. Some we talked about last week that some of it came out of Babylonia, where they said this was from the gods, and they had a polytheistic base. You don't believe that as a scientist. What I'm saying is that the definitions have kind of cruised through history, and now we've got these characteristics that seem to be arbitrarily placed on the signs, and I'm saying, why should anybody believe that those characteristics fall for those signs?
Well, I suppose from a scientific point of view, you should say probably you shouldn't just believe it. Astrology is not based on belief. It's based on information. It's based
what is
on
the evidence that science gives us that backs it up?
Well, I think the evidence that you're looking for is the thousands of years of collected information. As I said, for like the planet Mars, we've seen it go around 2,000 times. It's been observed in every culture by literally millions of people, and they record and they put their heads together and try and determine if there's anything that you can predict when Mars is in a certain particular place. It will have a certain type of influence. Obviously, a great deal of the information that they come up with doesn't work. The same in any scientific experiment, but over a great period of time, you begin to get a repeat in your data, and you begin to see that there are certain things that you can say about it. Now, in regards to what you said about polytheistic origins, let me point out that you could say that monotheistic religions originally, if you go back far enough, were polytheistic. There's no question. If you want to go back to 8,000...
Don't say that. Don't say that.
You have crossed over into my bailiwick.
Well, if you want to say that 8,000 or 10,000 BC, astrology sometimes surfaced as a religion, you can say that, but it hasn't been practiced by the great men of astrology that way for literally thousands of years. The point is that we're not up here representing worship of the stars. We're talking about studying it.
So your main proof for the effect of what happens to people, that under certain signs this effect should take place to certain people, is based on basically thousands of years of history.
Empirical evidence.
Okay, then why is it that all astrologers don't agree and you've got it mapped out cold?
The same reason that all scientists don't agree. If you were to take a lot of geologists into this room, they would agree on most things, but there would be certain...
But that's not science. See, then it's still hypothesis. A scientific theory is where people that are Hindus, Buddhists, Christians can all look at it, it's demonstrable, it's repeatable, and if they all see the evidence, then it becomes a theory.
That's what the layman thinks, but you're oversimplifying a great deal. For example, in geology, the best geologists in the world argue over what causes the continents on this planet to drift. It is, I
thought you might say that, so I asked Purdue University, a doctor of astronomy, PhD from the University of Illinois, and 3 degrees in astronomy, to give us a statement from the scientific angle concerning astrology. And this is from Dr. Sherman Kaniji at Purdue. And he says, as a professional astronomer and as one who has researched the pros and cons of astrology for several years now, I have concluded that, 1, nearly all astronomers would agree that the sun, moon, planets, and even the most distant stars do indeed exert the forces on human beings on the earth. However, the effects, which is what we're talking about, the effects of the sun and the moon on humans are either not well established or are not of the type that traditional astrologers would claim. Traditional astrologers claim more than a mere influence. The claim that the moon's presence in one's sun sign means that one will undergo emotional upheavals has no relation to the occurrence of the tides, for example. Also, the known forces from the stars and planets on a baby are negligible compared to terrestrial forces such as the gravitation of the body of the doctor who delivers the baby.
Sure.
Even given the existence of such forces, there is little reason to believe that they could affect the personalities of babies born when the celestial bodies are at a particular position in the sky. Most statistical studies that have been done to test whether astrology works have failed to confirm astrological claims. The few that do seem to support astrology have been criticized for their poor design or their faulty use of statistical methods.
At the current level of statistical testing, most of the statistical tests that have been used to test astrology are far too primitive a test, because the number of variables that are being integrated in some of the conclusions are too great for the statistical test. In other words,
what statistical test do you want to point to that proves your point? Give us something that you think that astrology can prove scientifically.
Well, for example, I think probably one of the more reliable ones is the Gauquelin studies.
I'm glad you brought that up. Okay, let's talk about that.
Okay.
What do you want to say that Gauquelin actually proved?
Well, what Gauquelin demonstrated, and please forgive us for the mispronunciation of his very difficult to pronounce French name. We all say it slightly differently, and they're all wrong, I'm sure. We need him here to say how to pronounce it. But basically, Gauquelin tried to demonstrate that if planets were near what astrologers call angles, which is in a more layman sense would be rising, setting on the celestial meridian at the time of birth, at either end of it, that they had a very strong effect on personality. Now, he did not say, for example, the statistical findings demonstrated that if someone had Mars rising at the time of birth. Notice we're not talking about astrological signs. We're talking about planets. If we had Mars rising at the time of birth, that there was a slightly greater likelihood that this person might be involved in certain pursuits in life than if they didn't have Mars. We're not saying that everyone that has Mars is going to be involved in that pursuit. For example, he finds a slightly higher characteristic of Mars in military people with military backgrounds.
Can I read you a quote from Gauquelin on his own study?
Mm-hmm. I know what the quote's going to be.
Okay. Gauquelin himself said this: "Every attempt, whether of astrologers or scientists, to produce evidence of the validity of astrological laws has been in vain. It is now quite certain that the signs in the sky which presided over our births have no power whatever to decide our fates, to affect our hereditary characteristics, or play any part, however humble, in the totality of effects, random and otherwise, which form the fabric of our lives and mold our impulses to action. Confronted with science, modern and traditional astrology are seen to be imaginary doctrines." Now that's Gauquelin on that very study.
Yes, and I realize, of course, before I even mentioned the Gauquelin that he had.
But why did you mention a scientist then as proof when he himself says it's not?
Well, of course, Gauquelin wrote quite a few books, and the one that you're quoting from is a later book. He reversed his own opinion on some of his own work. I think there are a lot of people that have studied his work that find that the work is to a large extent verified.
I asked Dr. Weldon, in his book, he has researched and done a couple chapters on Gauquelin. Tell us about what you found.
This is the latest book that I could find by Gauquelin, and he says this in the conclusion. He says, "Can there be a conclusion?" He says, "I am still tormented by two feuding demons. The first is the fear of having been mistaken and asserting that astral influence is real. The second is the agonizing thought of all I have been unable to discover or explain." And he goes on to say, after 30 years, he's still fascinated by the subject, and he concludes, quote, "But today I would not allow myself to draw drastic conclusions as I have sometimes done in the past." End quote. So the whole problem with the Gauquelin study is that it's been investigated for 20 years. It is still inconclusive. There have been a number of tests done on the Mars effect, and nothing conclusive can be said about it. It has not proven an astrological effect.
All right, we're going to take a break right here, and I want to come back, to you folks on this, and we got to keep moving. Please stick with us. We'll be right back. Okay, we're back, and we're talking about the scientific evidence for the verification, the validity of astrology. But what I love, and I think people out there in the audience, they just love how sure you astrologers are that this is what it is, okay? And I mean, we haven't crossed that bridge yet. And here I'm quoting another PhD, Ken Boa, who also has a PhD here in the sciences, and he says, "How do astrologers know that their method of interpretation is valid? What is the basis, for example, for saying that the sextile and the trine aspects are good and the opposition and square aspects are bad? Is it because of mythology? Who told you guys?"
We don't say that. We say something else about them that's been interpreted.
But where do you get that information? I want to know, where did you get it?
You seem to have dwelled on this particular point a great deal.
I'm still waiting for an answer.
Okay, I've given you the answer. I'm going to give you the same answer over again. The basis of science since the Renaissance is to go by information, by data. In other words, you don't make up your mind what something means. You go out and collect data, and you make up your mind after you analyze the data. We have 6,000 years of data.
Okay, let me bring up 4 things that in reading the literature I've found. Number 1 is you're assuming about 4 things. You're assuming, number 1, is that you've got an infallible recorder, that they all recorded it absolutely perfect, no errors. And even the guys in the association, Maxine, that I've been reading say, you got to scratch that. We got to do a lot more research, get rid of all the myths, okay?
Sure.
Number 2 is it would suggest that we have now, after we've gotten this body of literature from an infallible recorder, we have an infallible interpreter to find out where the error is at. In other words, if Maxine's buddies are saying the truth in their books, the fact is that we've still got to weed that out. We don't have a body of information that is solid. And number 3, if we did have what you say, this tradition going on back, then there would be just one book. The astrologers would open it up, and it's like Karen was saying, you put the computer on, and basically the things go in, and we all know, and voila, it'd be easy for our scientists to check this out, and we'd be in business. But the problem is the astrologers themselves have different theories, as we've talked about in the other program, and the fact is the data isn't condensed yet. And I think you would admit that yourself, wouldn't you?
Well, yes, John, I thought you were supposed to be asking us the questions.
Well, I'm just saying, isn't that true?
A good deal of what you say is true, but that is also true of every other science to exactly the same degree. Obviously, the problem...
Wait.
Yeah, I would really disagree with that. Astrology is so contradictory it can't possibly be true. The people I talked with at the convention, I got different answers on whether or not they used the same house system. There's all kinds of different house systems. The relevancy of the aspects, the angular relationship between planets, on and on and on. Again, one contradiction after. The books that I looked at were just full of contradictions, and even leading astrologers admit that there is a great deal of contradiction in astrology. But I do want to go back to one point that you had mentioned earlier, Terry, that I did not take your course, and I did. It was given July 6th at 3 o'clock. It was the archetype of planets, and you began by stating the real basis of astrology. The real basis of astrology is the planets. And Maxine, I did take your course as well on July 6th, 1:15 p.m. to 3 o'clock. It was called Can I Rise Above My Chart? And in that course you stated, quote, I have many experiences in the spirit world, and I think channeling is very important, end quote. Quote again, channeling is wonderful if you have a guide that you can trust and is spiritual.
That's correct. May I explain?
And you also stated, quote, you are God, unquote, speaking to the audience, and who we are is God in an earthbound body. Now, number 1, that's not Christian theology. That's pantheism. Okay, and number 2, spirit guides fit the characteristics of demons, whether you're looking at it from a historical perspective or from the perspective of biblical demonology. You can go into any ancient culture or modern culture you want. They all believe in the reality of evil spirits. You look at the characteristics of those spirits, you look at the characteristics of modern spirit guides that you find in channeling, and they are one and the same.
May I respond to that?
Certainly, go ahead.
First of all, what I said you've lifted out of context, but since you have said it, I do want to respond to it. Many of my colleagues do use spirit guides. You asked me if I use them. No, I do not. I think channeling is wonderful if you have a wonderful spirit guide, and the truth is there are wonderful spirit guides. I said that because many of my colleagues do use them. Many of my colleagues use many things that I don't. That does not mean that astrology is wrong or that they are wrong.
Well, it was earlier stated that astrology is not something occultic. Let me read you a few statements from astrologers on the nature of astrology itself in this regard. Sepharael, who was Walter Old, he was a Kabbalist and a Theosophist. He says this, quote, the astrologic art is held to be the key to all the occult sciences. Sybil Leek, the famous witch, in her book, My Life in Astrology, says, quote, astrology is my science, witchcraft is my religion. Doreen Valiente, in her book, An ABC of Witchcraft, Past and Present, she's a practicing witch, says, quote, astrology is another of the fundamentals of magic. It is studied by witch and magician alike, end quote. Theosophist and humanistic astrologer Dane Rudyard states, quote, the astrologer has authority as one who deals understandingly and effectively with the occult, unquote. And he says, quote, astrology is occult knowledge, unquote. Henry Weingarten, a leading astrologer, director of the National Astrological Society in New York, says that, quote, almost all occultists use astrological timing in their work, end quote.
Okay, hold on, John. First of all, it's not unusual, Karen, because you also picked up in your professional astrological counsel, you also picked up a spirit guide. Why is it so easy in astrology when you get into it, because that you didn't go looking for one, but you also picked one up yourself. How did that happen, and what are we talking about here? Because I understand that this might be new to the audience, but it is not new, especially in your story.
Okay, I didn't go looking for one in those words and those terms, but I went looking for the meaning and what makes astrology work. And whether they were people, and there were some good old-fashioned occultists, astrologers, probably the most candid of the astrologers I knew, and then there were the New Age types, you know, who were trying to refurbish the image a little bit. But the thing that makes astrology work is an intermediary source of knowledge, an intermediary source of a higher intuition than you could know about the character of the person, about the future of the person. This, you know, when I went after it through meditation. I went after it through putting myself in altered states of consciousness by various methods. There's a whole vast array of technologies by which you can do this. And as I said before, any astrology that is done well is done in an altered state. Otherwise, it's schlock astrology. And I really believe that any astrologer you know, will hold to that. However they alter their consciousness, whether it's through techniques of Eastern Zen meditation or, you know, any kind of Eastern meditation. In my experience, I have tried many things. They all lead to the same road. They all end up in the same eventuality, and that is you need an intermediary source. I would like to just ask Maxine.
All right, we have to hold the question until next week. We're out of time.
Okay.
We'll get the question on the board and we'll start with it.
Okay.
What is the question?
The question is, what is a wonderful spirit guide? What characteristics would a wonderful spirit guide?
I'd like to know too, and I think the audience would, and if you'll join us next week, we'll start with that question. All right, we're having a fascinating conversation here concerning astrology and how does it work and why does it work. And we actually have 3 professional astrologers on the platform, and one who, of those professional astrologers, who has left. And I'd like to come to you. You were making some pretty interesting statements last week. You had divided astrologers into basically 3 groups, and you had asked a question. And I'd like you just to refresh the audience's mind. What were those 3 groups and what you said, and then let's pick up the conversation right there. Karen?
Okay, that there are 3 types of astrology, or 3 levels of astrology, in terms of how well it's done or how accurately or dramatic your successes are. Well, the first is, the highest level is psychic, in which you need, you know, if you don't want to talk about spirit guides, in which you need psychic ability. You know, however you want to develop that or phrase that, you need psychic ability. The second is intuitive, where you're just psyching out the person, not necessarily psychically, but just slyly. By talking to them and by using and choosing from among an array of indicators you have in your chart.
We've had professional magicians on here that would talk about that like a cold reading, or psychologists that would be just good at reading people.
Right.
It's not actually using the astrology, but you're using other abilities.
You're using it. You're priming the pump, and you're using that to talk from. And the other is bad astrology, or schlock astrology, which is just you get your, you know, what Mars in the 2nd house in Capricorn, trine Venus in the whatever house and whatever sign, you know, what all those mean, and you just look in the cookbook for the definition, you put that out, and you got this list of definitions, lots of which are contradictory, and, you know, you try to integrate those. So those are the 3 levels. And
what you felt guilty about is that when you were starting to give information, you started to say, well, how sure am I about this information?
I felt that I did not have a reliable source. I felt that I didn't know how. Again, you know, I was trying to figure out how this darn thing works. How could I get this, you know, these insights, these psychic insights, to be reliable?
Which then you picked up. Then you picked up another source of power. Tell us about that.
Well, in this search, to find this out, and again, in talking to other astrologers and finding out that they had spirit guides, and this was not, I would expect at this time this would be kind of common knowledge. It's trendy, Shirley MacLaine and all, so, maybe we tell our clients this, I don't know. We never did. It was, as I say, common knowledge among ourselves that we had these sources. There are ways to tap into these powers, and everybody had a lot of different ways, a lot of different traditions, they were involved, and I knew some Kabbalists. I knew my mentor in astrology and my teacher was a priestess in an Egyptian religion. This was something that you found out as you sort of moved along. Most accomplished astrologer in the area. And there were other instances of other things people were involved in that led me to believe this is the way to go. Well, I tried putting myself in these altered states. The one that finally connected is the pretty down-home method. Teenagers use it all the time. It's the old Ouija board. I chose the Ouija board because I wanted something that would be objective in the sense that if thoughts came to my mind, which they eventually did, just like a computer screen, and I could see the entire text, my hand still had to move apart from my knowing what the word was going to be, and to me that felt like objectivity, So I used the Ouija board. I got over a 100-page transcript. I channeled for approximately, maybe on an average, 2 hours a day for 18 months. I channeled several entities, 2 in particular. And before I tell you, what they shared with me, I would like to know what Maxine feels constitutes what she would call a wonderful spirit guide, one whom we can trust.
Well, first of all, you're asking me a question about an area that I'm not versed in, so I really cannot answer that.
But you did say that there were wonderful spirit guides.
Except, if you let me finish,
okay.
Except to say that there are spirit guides that I've read about. For example, in Shirley MacLaine's book, those guides that give us loving, caring information that do not leech off of us as apparently yours did. That would be what I would call a loving spirit guide. But I'm not involved in spirit guides. And I disagree with what you're saying about, I absolutely disagree with what you're saying about the third category, that the only way to really make a hit is in an altered state. I myself, when I read a chart, am not in an altered state. I don't know what you mean when you say an altered state. When you read a horoscope for somebody, when I read a client's horoscope, I get their birth information ahead of time. I set up the chart, and I don't look at it until they arrive because I want it to be clear and fresh in my mind. When they arrive, I do not question them. I do not ask them what's going on in their life because it's perfectly evident when you read it in the chart. It's very matter of fact. It's very easy to read when you're well versed in it. I can understand what you mean about not wanting people to be dependent on you. And I do believe that people do have their free will. So I don't have the problem that you had with it. Now, what I do with my clients is not anything with a Ouija board or anything with a spirit guide. And the fact that I've been in business for 18 years says that if I were in any way giving out negative information or were not serving them, and it is my honor to serve. It is my joy to serve.
Let me ask a question to you, Maxine. When Dr. Weldon was giving the statistics last week about what he saw at the convention, do you feel out of place with all of your buddies that are teaching? And how many did you say were talking about their spirit guides? I'd say 1 out of 2. Admitted, not that they had, either they had spirit guides or they were influenced by spiritism in some aspect. Now these were the people that were teaching the courses?
8 out of the 9 courses I took, the people admitted to that. Of the 50 people I talked to or interviewed, had them fill out questionnaires, it was about 1 and 2. But the thing is that 80% of them were into other forms of the occult, primarily through astrological symbolism, the I Ching, tarot cards, runes, other forms of divination. And astrology, again, is an open door to the occult, and that's where you pick up your spirit guides.
Maxine said she didn't have an altered state of consciousness, and I think you asked her a question that we got lost there for a second, which is, do you meditate?
Yes, I do.
And you don't think that meditation creates an altered state of consciousness?
I don't. I'm not in an altered state of consciousness when I'm reading somebody's horoscope.
But that wasn't what the question was. Do you get into altered states of consciousness through your meditation?
I don't know.
That was my point.
I don't
You
know.
could be very well influenced by what the Bible says is satanic power and not even know it.
But if I pray...
To
and
who?
To Jesus.
Who is he?
Who is Jesus?
Who is Jesus?
You don't know?
I want you to tell me who you think he is.
Well, I'm here to discuss astrology. I'm here to discuss astrology, and I feel that
this is really the core of it, though.
I think that,
I think
since you
I-
considered yourself the expert on that, you should
I think
define
you
that.
should be the one to define.
But there are different Jesuses. The Jesus of the New Age movement is one of the avatars of world religions. The Jesus of the Jehovah's Witnesses is the Archangel Michael. The Jesus of the Mormons is one God among many gods. The Jesus of the Spiritists is an advanced medium in the sixth sphere. Who's your Jesus?
Jesus of Nazareth.
Eternal God in human flesh?
Yes.
Second person of the Trinity?
You're not hearing me.
I just want definitions. Eternal God in human flesh.
I'm answering you.
He's eternal God in human flesh.
Well, why don't you get your bottom line question?
That's it. Who is he?
Jesus of Nazareth, a Jewish rabbi who said, I've come to teach the world love.
Did you
I've
believe
come
it?
to give you the word. I've come to tell you that you can be free. I've come to tell you that we are love and that we're to love one another. That's the Jesus I believe.
Do you believe?
That's the Jesus I believe.
Just a second.
That's
Do you
the Jesus I
believe? Do you believe the Jesus who said, "I am the way, the truth, and the life.
Yes.
No one comes to the Father but through me.
Yes.
Neither is there salvation in any other. There is no other name given under heaven among men whereby you must be saved. Jesus Christ." Do you believe that?
Yes.
So for you confess that Jesus Christ is God.
Mm-hmm.
Eternal God in
Yes.
human flesh. Then why don't you obey him?
Oh, come on now, you're baiting me.
Oh, you don't obey him.
I do obey him.
Yes, you do. He told you.
That's right, I do.
No, you don't obey him. You deny the authority of Christ and of the Scriptures by maintaining that astrology, which God condemns, you can affirm.
God does not condemn
Oh, yes, he
astrology.
does. I give you a whole bunch of references. You want
I
them?
understand that. No, I don't.
That's your point.
That's
You
true.
don't care.
I don't care about what you're going to read.
You don't
That's
care
true.
about Scripture.
No, that's not true.
That's the Scripture.
Could someone else say anything to break up this ridiculous argument?
Well, I think it's ridiculous to you because you're not in it. You're just observing, as most scientists do.
But I want to be in it.
May I say that in the Bible, you can take anything and lift it out of context. What I stand on is my faith and my truth.
I maintain that we have here the same type of contradiction as we have in astrological sources and methods, which namely is, I can affirm that Jesus Christ is God. I can affirm he's the final authority. I can affirm he's the way, the truth, and the life. But on astrology, he's wrong.
He never
there
said
it is.
astrology was wrong.
He said the occult was evil.
Jesus Christ never said astrology was wrong. In Luke, he said, look to the heavens. He said, you'll see the signs.
You weren't in the first program, were you?
Here's where we define astrologers as a cult, and then therefore Jesus.
All right, let's take a break right here, and I want to come back. To you folks on this, and we got to keep moving. Please stick with us. We'll be right back. All right, we're talking about astrology, and in the last couple of weeks we've always gotten to definitions, and let me start off with some biblical definitions so we can see if we can hit this once and for all. Let me start with one from Deuteronomy 4:19, which says, Moses says, "And when you look up to the sky and see the sun, the moon, and the stars, all the heavenly array, do not be enticed into bowing down to them and worshiping things the Lord your God has apportioned to all the nations under heaven." Over in Isaiah 47:13 and 14 and 15, "All the counsel you have received," God says to the people, "has only worn you out. Let your astrologers come forward, those stargazers who make predictions month by month. Let them save you from what is coming upon you. Surely they are like stubble. The fire will burn them up. They cannot even save themselves from the power of the flame." And it goes on, "That is all they can do for you. These you have labored with and trafficked with since childhood. Each of them goes on in his error. There is not one that can save you." And then a specific injunction, which is in Deuteronomy 18:19. "Let no one be found among you who practices divination or sorcery, interprets omens, engages in witchcraft, or casts spells, or who is a medium, or spiritist, or who consults the dead. Anyone who does these things is detestable to the Lord." Now, A solid definition of divination from any biblical encyclopedia will state divination is of two sources. Number one, it's obtaining knowledge by outward signs. And there are two areas. Artificial or fake divination depends on the skill of the agent only, reading and interpreting certain signs. Then there is the second area, inspirational divination, where the person is under the immediate influence or control of spirits who enable him to discern the future and to utter information that otherwise he would not be able to do. Now, the Bible then has a strict admonition in the Old Testament from Moses, speaking for God, that divination, or of both kinds, both of just the person on a natural basis giving out information, or even under the influence of spirits giving out information, obtaining knowledge of the future or of the immediate present by outward signs, is condemned. Now, I think that at least tells us what the biblical record is saying. That is open for discussion, but let me throw one more other thing on the table here, and that is that I'd like to quote from Bernard Gittleson, who says, "One friend of mine was amazed that on the first visit, her astrologer was able to pinpoint major life events that the astrologer could never have known about, to specific 2-week periods that occurred 20 years before they met. In other words, don't be surprised by what your astrologer knows about you." And Karen, you finally, as a professional astrologer for 12 years, got to a point where you could do some of those things. You never told us what actually you told to some of your clients. But for those people that are just joining us this week, as you actually were a professional astrologer giving information to people, you said that there were 3 bases of astrology. You had rejected the first 2, and you finally hit pay dirt. What was the pay dirt?
It was psychic astrology, and you know, there are many ways to get into this. I was still skeptic enough to reject the kind of religious overtones of my old-fashioned occult buddies, you know, who said these are spirits, and you know, you use them or they use you, and you know, it's kind of a deal you strike. But I was also studying Jungian psychology, and that seemed a very fertile field. As an explanation for astrology, Jungian psychology offers a couple of ideas or theories that if an astrologer latches onto them, utilizes them in work with their clients and work with themselves, you know, it does lead to spirit guide contact, or it does lead to increased DSP, or however you want to phrase it. One of the concepts is synchronicity, and the other is archetype. And if you look at Jung's definition of synchronicity and his book, Collective, which one is this? Structure and Dynamics of the Psyche. He says that this is a principle that connects a psyche, an individual mind, with a physical object, and it is an acausal principle. We're not talking about the planet causing a person to behave this way or to be motivated in this way, but there is still a principle operative there which connects these two. What is it? It manifests itself in meaningful coincidences in time, which astrologers read in their charts. Well, he says that what activates it, that contact, is the archetypal processes in the unconscious. Then you have to ask him, okay, what do you mean by archetypal processes? And you go to his work on archetypes in the unconscious, and archetype is extremely difficult to define. I don't blame him for that, because it's really, you know, it's a concept that does tend to get away from you. There is, first of all, no content in an archetype. There's even very little form. But what an archetype is, it is something that is dynamic, that works in and on the psyche, in and on my mind, to form, well, first of all, it's not even part of my psyche. Okay, so it's like an alien something that's working in and on my psyche. He said it was analogous to the axial system of a crystal, in that it utilizes the material and the content of something else other than itself, like me, my mind and my thoughts, to form out of its own logic, or with its own logic and intention, an image or an idea, which then connects it with the person. Now, if you do archetypal meditation, if you do archetypal work with your clients or in chart reading, if you really try to understand the archetypal images which these planets present, in other words, if you're doing astrology based on, you know, the archetype of Mars, the archetype of Venus, getting in again to the history, no way can you pass off the ancient ideas that these are gods and goddesses who have certain characteristics and requirements of human beings. But that's all put in perspective. You know, it's psychoanalytic jargon. It's not ancient religion. But if you're doing this work, if you go into this over and over again, and if your intention is to gain enlightenment or to gain empowerment through relationship with the archetypes in your own unconscious, and in facilitating this with your client, well, this is the stuff demonic possession is made of. And so what you are doing is you're opening yourself up to this alien intelligence. The Greek word for demon is disembodied intelligence. You know, I'm not talking about devils with horns and stuff. This is simply disembodied intelligence. You know, extraterrestrials. I mean, there's lots of people's theories about what these guys are and, you know, who they are and all the rest of it. The Bible speaks of them as the powers, rulers, and authorities.
All right, next week we're going to find out how this information about spirit guides and spiritism and Carl Gustav Jung and psychology, how this impacts Terry as a scientist who is trying to promote astrology on a scientific basis. And so I hope that you'll join us. Let me ask you this, have you ever looked at a horoscope? Have you ever checked out what the stars are supposed to say about your life for the day? According to some of the statistics I'm reading, 40 million Americans dabble in astrology, and what we're talking about with 5 different people here on the program is astrology credible? What is the scientific evidence? In the last weeks of time, we've started with basic definitions of astrology and then worked into some very interesting things. But let me just give you a shorthand one here. Astrology is the study of the heavens and the influence they exert upon the lives and affairs of humanity. But then we found out that there are some astrologers that they don't use just the basic charts. They have picked up spirit guides along the way, so that a fellow like Stromer in his book says, as we look honestly at astrology, and this is a professional astrologer, we begin to see that adherents of this system, without knowing it, are banging on the door through which communication is established with knowledgeable yet deceptive spirit beings. Eventually that door opens. And that opening produces an appalling development in the adherent's life. He or she matures in the craft in a most unthought of manner as a spirit medium. And Karen, that's basically what happened to you, isn't it?
Well, in actuality, it was a demon, a spirit guide. You know, again, there are many ways to...
And you made promises to your helper.
Yes.
Didn't you? What kind of promises did you make?
Well, I guess they were commitments more than promises, and this entity worked with me for a year and a half, and there were 2 of them, and she was a wonderful spirit guide. She was very loving. The information that she gave me and the ways in which she helped me see my situation, I think, were instrumental in saving my marriage at one point. She gave me much accurate information to help friends. She also helped me to understand that as we are evolving into God, such distinctions as good and evil are inconsequential. Therefore, Christians and people who, you know, are not as far along on the path, such distinctions as truth and falsehood are inconsequential, because God, and this is the Jungian view, especially if you read his work, 7 Sermons of the Dead, because God subsumes in himself all polarities. He is above good and evil. He is above truth and falsehood. And the farther you are along on this path, the less consequential those distinctions are to you. This filters down into the daily life.
Okay, the bottom line, because I want to come back to Terry here, the bottom line for you, though, was that spirit guide good or bad for you?
In the end, bad, although she seemed terrific at the time, and she gave me many wonderful
experiences. Let's come back to that story later. But the fact is, what I want to get to is that you don't you don't deny the fact that many astrologers are using spirit guides. We got the literature full of them. But you aren't coming from that direction. Is that correct?
That's correct. Okay, well, first of all, I don't agree with it. The way that it's been defined here, that's not even the way I see it particularly as being practiced. I think a lot of times we see a clever twisting of words. But be that as it may, define it as you will, it's not something that I do. It's not something that I have the ability to do. For example, I don't channel any entities. I'm very dubious about, and I think I speak, for example, of Jeff Green, probably one of the single greatest astrologers today. He said, let's face it, probably 9 out of every 10 people that claim to be channeling entities, they're not channeling positive or negative entities. They're not channeling entities at all. They're just taking your money. Now, we're not saying that this is impossible. If I've never channeled an entity, how can I say whether it's possible or not if I've never had that personal experience?
I agree. I would like to have a guess from you as to why you think that so many astrologers are going that direction.
Well, first of all, I've been in astrology for about over 20 years. And during that 20 years' time, very few of those years has this particular concept been around. I think there are fads within astrology, just as there are fads within the sciences and fads within any place else in life. And I think recently, it's been there's been a channeling fad. And you've noticed it. You've seen all of a sudden everybody's channeling, but they weren't a couple of years ago. And it's not just in astrology. It's not just that astrology people. Probably most of the channelers have absolutely nothing to do with astrology. Astrology is probably too complicated and detailed for them to get into. So I think that probably a lot of them are not on the up and up. But I don't think, as a lot of your guests probably think here, that this is some sort of evil plot to take over the world, that they're channeling demonic spirits or something like that. I'm not even here to make that judgment. I think in most cases, this is probably just a case of somebody trying to perhaps separate you from your money. And I think we have to realize that goes on in every profession. These people have attacked particular astrologers that make some pretty bizarre claims rather than looking at the whole body of astrologers. I think we could do the same thing within Christianity. It has come up very much lately.
Let's do it. Dr. Weldon, you've written in your book, quote, astrology is a proven occult art. I only got a minute and a half, so condense it, okay? Astrology is a proven occult art by virtue of its many connections to numerous other forms of occultism. Astrology is a potential introduction to a much wider practice of occult activity. Prove it. What do you mean?
Well, I think, first of all, that historically there's a much deeper tie into Spiritism than has been suggested. Even Ptolemy stated, quote, they only who are inspired by the deity or God can predict particulars. In 16th and 17th century England, astrologers claimed to get their knowledge from spirit guides. So I think that there is a much greater tie into Spiritism historically than has been suggested. But there are 6 or 7 different converging lines of evidence, all of which support the conclusion that astrology is an occult practice. It always has been. It's accepted historically. Many astrologers today accept the fact that it is an occult art. Most of the people I contacted at the AFA convention, which claims to offer astrology as a science, were into the occult. It developed psychic abilities, and 80% of the people I interviewed, they admitted this, and that they became psychic through astrology. There are any number of spirit-dictated books on astrology. Irene Diamond, who was one of my first instructor at the conference, had 3 books, she says, were dictated by her spirit guides on astrology. Alice Bailey, her spirit guide, the Tibetan, dictated esoteric astrology. Edgar Casey, trance medium, dictated 2,500 readings on astrology. It's important to remember that astrologers do not always admit the fact that they have spirit guides. I talked to several people at the conference who initially said no, and then later they said yes, they did have spirit guides when they were pressed on the issue. All in all, astrology is an occult practice.
All right, Maxine, we're going to take a break. When I come back, I want to ask you a question about the president, your buddy, your vice president of the American Federation of Astrologers, and I want to read a quote from the president about her astrological views, and we'll talk about it when we come right back. Hi, we're back, and Maxie, I'd like to come and talk with you about Doris Chase Doan, who is the president of the American Federation of Astrologers, and her book, Astrology, 30 Years Research, and she talks about her view of astrology. Thus, the birth chart maps the thought cells and thought structures within the unconscious mind. Now, that's quite a statement. I want to know how she knows that the birth chart maps the thought cells and the thought structures within the unconscious mind of the newborn babe and the positions of the planets. Here's how the stars affect it now, the celestial bodies. The positions of the planets indicate their kind, the kind of thought cells, the intensity of the thought cells, and the general direction of their desires. Do you believe that kind of thing?
Well, first of all, you're asking me to comment on somebody else's book. You're asking me to comment on a book of Doris Chase Doan, who is probably one of the foremost astrologers in the country today from a scientific standpoint. You would have to ask...
I say something, if I can interrupt. I don't like to interrupt, but I took her class. To say that she is one of the foremost scientific astrologers, she has been a spiritist for about 35 years. The Church of Light, of which she has been a member, is an earthly organization that has been contacted by what they call the Brotherhood of Light, which is a spiritistic hierarchy that works through the earthly organization, the Church of Light. She has taught courses in this on at least a dozen different forms of the occult. I talked with her after her class called The Art of Transmutation. She said, quote, "The Spirit's work through the organization," end quote, "is very important to the work of astrology." That is not scientific, that's occultic.
All right. I just wanted to know, was that your view too? I thought maybe as being the vice president, that's not your view astrologically?
Well, I'm not clear exactly what she's saying. And what I would say is that you would have to ask her exactly what she means.
Let me come back to you. What is the importance of the birth date as far as you're concerned?
As far as I'm concerned, when a baby is born, that chart represents God's plan for that child in this lifetime.
Why is it God's plan?
Because astrology is God's plan.
Who told you?
The Bible.
Where did the Bible tell you?
In Genesis.
Where?
In Genesis.
Where?
Excuse me one moment. It says that when, and of course you are the biblical scholar, so I'm going to be quoting from memory, but it's when God said that God put the sun and the moon in the heavens for signs.
Well, let me read it to you then, okay? Verse 14, chapter 1, God said, "Let there be lights in the expanse of the sky to separate the day from the night, and let them serve as signs to mark seasons and days and years. And let them be lights in the expanse of the sky to give light on the earth." And it was so. God made two great lights, the greater light to govern the day, the lesser light to govern the night. He also made the stars. God set them in the expanse of the sky to give light on the earth, to govern the day and the night, and to separate light from darkness. And God saw that it was good.
John, you know very well.
I want to hear what Maxine has to say. That was the verse she was quoting. Now, give me the interpretation.
I just did.
What is it?
I just said it to you.
Okay, tell me again, please.
What I said was that God put the planets in the heavens for signs. And as an astrologer, I read those signs.
Mm-hmm.
John, you know very well that there are numerous biblical translations of that passage. You picked the particular Bible translation that you preferred, but a lot of those...
I picked the one that's a standard NIV interpretation.
Yeah, the standard NIV, but there are other Bibles, as you know.
NIV is the most scholarly, up-to-date, accurate translation of all the scholars right now in the market.
There are...
Oh, wait a second. Just a second. I want to ask a question. How do you know what he uses as a translation?
Because I'm familiar with that particular translation.
You are. And
Yes,
how many translations have you checked on the Hebrew that say that? Or English?
Okay, well, first of all, he didn't check the Hebrew either, but...
I think he did. He's pretty good at it.
What I'm pointing out here is that that particular passage obviously when it speaks of putting signs in the sky, some of the Bible translations say signs to mark seasons. Some say signs to mark festivals. Others just say that the lights are placed in the sky as signs and to mark seasons, and in other words, they translate it differently. I've looked at about 4 or 5 different Bible translations, and I noticed there's quite a difference.
Let me quote you Dr. Gleason Archer, professor who corrects the lexicon, PhD, graduate from Harvard. In the footnote, he says, signs. In the ways that they're mentioned here, not in any astrological sense.
Yes, I read that one too.
That's from an authority on the linguistics.
I have a commentary in here from a man who is a Hebrew scholar and who just recently died, and he said that particular interpretation would be absurd to any modern rabbi. So
Genesis, which was written by Moses, in a couple books over, where he absolutely condemns it, he goofed in the front.
No, we're not saying that at all.
So
John, you never allowed me to respond to your so-called condemnation. In the first place, the so-called condemnations that you read, several passages of which had to do with star worship. I would absolutely agree. When we talk about a meteorologist studying the weather and predicting what will happen tomorrow, we don't assume that the meteorologist worships the
Let
weather.
no one be found among you who practices divination. I thought I gave a real concise explanation from the Bible dictionary, any one that you want to pick out on what divination was.
Yes, you did, and you gave two
That's
definitions.
That's Deuteronomy 18.
You gave two definitions of divination, and the first definition of divination you gave would fit virtually any modern science today.
No, it wouldn't.
Yes, it would.
Why would you say that?
Read it.
Divination is the fact of picking out signs about the future and making an interpretation?
Well, you read two different definitions of divination.
All right, I'll read it again. Number one is that it's obtaining knowledge by outward signs. Artificial, fake divination depends on the skill of the agent, reading and interpreting certain signs or omens. Inspirational divination, the medium is under the immediate influence or control of spirits, who enable him to discern the future and utter oracles of what he sees.
Obtaining information by outward signs. You don't think that a meteorologist, when he consults the positions of air masses in fronts, those are not outward signs in the physical world, and he doesn't look at those and attempt to predict the weather? And do we not admit that probably 50% of the time he's wrong? But nevertheless, we don't accuse him of divination when he does that.
Unger's Bible Dictionary was very plain in what they said, and they referred to all of the practices of the Canaanites, the Babylonians, and so on, as illustrations, not in the sense of the heavens, which were made by God to be admired. Nothing wrong with admiring them, as long as you didn't worship them, as long as you didn't go to them for the information that you were only supposed to get from God.
Well, furthermore, in the quote that you mentioned on Isaiah 47:13 through 14, there's a clear example where they're talking, where first of all, if you back up and read several pages, you realize at the time the speaker, the writer of that, is condemning the entire Israel nation for many things, of which one of them he condemns for is astrology. But if you remember...
No, you're sorry, that's not the context. It's Babylon that he's condemning there.
Okay. At the time that he condemns the astrologers, he says that they do not have the power to save themselves from what they have predicted. I submit to you that if we take a modern parallel, when a meteorologist predicts that there's a tornado, we don't assume that the meteorologist has any power to stop tornadoes. We don't assume that if he's subjected to a tornado, he's not going to die as easily as any man.
I guess what's important in Isaiah 47:13, besides the fact of God saying judgment was coming, and that no matter what they were saying from the stars, that judgment would not be spared,
Exactly.
They couldn't do anything about that.
Exactly.
Also, it says, each of them goes on in his error, verse 15. There is not one that can save you. So he calls their practice error.
John, there's an important point here that Terry brought up about worship, because the Christian astrologers that I've talked to say, well, we don't engage in divination, and we do not engage in literal worship of the stars. We do not bow down to them. And in essence, which is simply a practice of counseling, and therefore they say that it is okay. In Deuteronomy 17, God says, if a man or a woman living among you in one of the towns the Lord gives you is found doing evil in the eyes of the Lord, your God, in violation of his covenant, and contrary to my command, has worshipped other gods, bowed down to them, or to the sun, or the moon, or the stars of the sky, and this has been brought to your attention, he goes on to say, you shall stone them to death. The death penalty was prescribed. In Acts, in the New Testament, in Acts chapter 7, verse 42, it says, but God turned away from the Israelites who were engaging in astrology and gave them over to the worship of the heavenly bodies. So God deliberately turned away from them. Now, what is worship? Is worship only bowing down in front of an idol or something? Worship involves what your life's attention is on, what you give your devotion to, and all kinds of other things which the astrologer gives to the starry host.
I guess then geologists worship rocks.
No,
I think it's very important to discuss something that was brought up before. Does the information that any astrologer have supersede, improve upon, or expand in any way the revelation that God has given to us in Scripture? In other words, what can you do for us that Jesus Christ and the God of the Bible hasn't already told us about and warned us about or done for us by sending his Son to be our Savior? No matter what your reason for practicing astrology may be, why don't you instead go to him who is the root and the offspring of David, the bright and the morning star? Why not go to the one who created the heavens instead of letting astrology take your eyes off the Creator and glue them on the creation? Instead, worship the God that made it, not the thing he made.
Maxine, how about just a final answer from you, then we were out of this program.
Okay, first of all, I can only speak for myself.
Right.
And speaking for myself, I put God first. I do not worship the planets. My astrology is my career. My love is God. My attention is on God all the time. As I'm speaking to you now and the words out of my mouth are talking about planets, my attention is on God. And that's the truth.
Okay. We're going to pick this up again next week, and we'll talk about these things further. Please join us. Welcome. We're talking about astrology, and of course I'm holding in my hand Time magazine, and it talked about Nancy Reagan, the First Lady's astrologer. A big article about Joan Quigley in here. One thing that fascinated me, though, Maxine, in this article was that it says, when they were talking about how they used to go to Jean Dixon, the Reagans used to go to Jean Dixon, the Reagans lost faith in Jean Dixon, and I was fascinated to find out what the reason was that they lost faith in her as an astrologer. And it said, the Reagans lost faith in her powers some years back. What kind of powers are they talking about?
I have absolutely no idea, but I can tell you that having been written up in magazines and newspapers myself, that articles of that nature use wording that is subject to misinterpretation, number one, and you're subject to being misquoted. I have no idea what they meant, and you would have to ask them.
Karen, what do you think?
Well, I think that Jean Dixon, like any other astrologer, has some real good hits and some not, and it's not all reliable information, and clients do tend to lose faith when the hits stop coming. And it depends also on how the client is linked to the astrologer, how dependent he or she feels on that particular person, as to whether he feels, you know, brash enough to go off and find someone else.
Dr. Weldon, in your book, you talk about not just the ideas of astrology, but you have also cataloged what you call the dangers of astrology, and that's one thing we have not gotten to. Are there dangers associated with astrology? Is the public being fairly warned about what could happen to them if they do go to an astrologer? Comment on that, if you would.
There clearly are dangers, potential dangers, especially for people that get into it naively and don't really understand what is involved. And that can happen through something as simple as a newspaper horoscope. A few hits and misses here and there, and there's a greater interest in astrology developed. They go to a professional astrologer who tells them things about themselves that no one could really know. Trust is generated, and then there's a logical progression. Once the clients are amazed by the self-disclosures, they generate trust. Trust leads to deception. Deception produces unwise or immoral decisions and actions, and these produce tragedy. Now let me show you some examples of why this is true. One astrologer predicted that a child would be born mentally retarded. And as a result, an individual, the mother, decided to have an abortion. Another advised a client against his child's appendectomy. The child died as a result. One mother murdered her own son because the astrologer said that he would live a life of mental illness, and she killed him to spare him this difficulty. A leading theologian who has studied the occult his entire life, Dr. Kurt Koch, stated that, quote, astrology has been responsible for a number of suicides and murders. To give you two illustrations, one astrologer told a client that she would not marry the man she was engaged to, but they would break up and that she would remain single. Well, she was deeply in love with this man, and she became more and more depressed and morose, and finally became suicidal and resolved to take her own life. And it was only through the power of Christ intervening that prevented that woman from taking her own life. In another case, an individual was told by his astrologer that his second wife would be the one that would make him truly happy, and his first wife would not. Well, he had to marry first in order to find a second wife. His first wife bore him 3 wonderful children. They had a happy marriage, but after their third child, he divorced his first wife and then married the one he thought and was promised by the astrologer would truly fulfill him and make him happy. She made his life miserable, and he divorced her. 6 lives at that point were in some sense, to some degree, degree ruined. And the problem with astrology is that decisions are made on the basis of the alleged influence of the stars or the planets as interpreted by an astrologer and often a spirit guide, a deceptive spirit being, that have no basis in reality. Once you have the entrance of spiritistic deception into the interpretation of a chart, you can encounter all kinds of potential problems and tragedies. So I think there is a potential danger for people who get involved in astrology.
Maxine, this brings up the whole issue of when you're actually giving counsel to people that trust you.
Yes, John.
Do you ever worry about the counsel that you're giving them?
I think very deeply about the counsel I give them, and I pray about it beforehand. I think the astrologer has an incredible responsibility. And the counsel that I give my clients, now I can only speak for me, the counsel I give my clients is I never tell somebody to do something or not do something. That's up to them. What I do is I read what I see. I do encourage them to ask me questions, and very often they will ask you, what would you do in my place? And my answer is, what I would do in your place is not what you would do in your place. So that the astrologer is simply reading the signs for the client. You do not tell a client, do this or do that. And I really cannot imagine how anybody, and now this is my personal opinion, I can't imagine how anybody could predict that a child would be mentally deficient. I don't know how, because I've studied astrology for 22 years. I've been a practicing astrologer for 18. I don't know how they do that. That's not to say that they can't, but I've not that ability. When I read somebody's chart, if I were to read your chart, if you ask me what I would do doesn't matter. It's what you choose to do. And the whole point of doing the chart is so that you don't become dependent on it. You don't want to become dependent on an astrologer.
My experience, though, has been that most people do become dependent on an astrologer because they vest in the astrologer almost a godlike authority.
Have you had any,
these people are, supposedly can predict the future to some degree, and about 80% of those that I talked to said that in general and specific instances, an astrologer is capable of predicting the future. What are the reasons people go to an astrologer for? The major questions in life: health, finances, will my spouse die? What about investments? What about relationships? Very key issues. And therefore, the answers that are given, you open up Pandora's box for potential misuse.
Those are key issues, but I think we have to realize that only about half of what astrology does is actually prediction, and that's a common misunderstanding about astrology. There is another part where you talk about character analysis and so forth, and personality characteristics in very much the same way a psychologist does. And I think that certainly we could say that the obvious misuse of astrology is pointed out in these cases.
Okay.
That similar misuses have occurred in psychology.
Two questions I have for you here, Terry. One is, maybe you're familiar with Richard Knoll. He's got an AFA insignia on his book,
yes,
Interpreting Astrology, and he's got one about the techniques of astrology. In there, he made an astounding statement to me. He was, first of all, taking apart astrology before he put it back together. And he said that astrologers, now correct me, and I want some figures here. He says other astrologers, 50–60% of them are frauds. Okay? 50 to 60% of them are frauds. Now, in what way are they frauds, and what can we do about that?
Well, of course, again, as I think as Maxine has said over here, I'm not sure what he had in mind. I'd have to have him here to ask him. My own particular belief wouldn't be that 50 or 60% of them are intentionally fraudulent.
That's the point that he makes.
Yeah,
they're not intentional, but they are fraud. For example, we were talking about the fact that we didn't like the idea of all these newspaper astrologers. Okay, well, that's a bundle right there.
First of all, it all depends on how much knowledge you have to have before you are permitted to call yourself an astrologer. I think we remember very well in the newspaper case where a very attractive young blonde lady applied to a particular newspaper syndicate, and within no time at all she was syndicated nationally with the sun sign column. She got rather I don't know, bold and admitted sometime later that she'd only studied astrology 3 weeks before they syndicated her. I've known cases of friends of mine that have been approached by major magazines in the country and asked to write a sun sign astrology column. And when my friend said, but I don't know anything of astrology, they said, oh, it doesn't matter anyway. You just write anything.
Doesn't that scare you?
It does scare me.
How many of those people do you think are out there?
Oh, it'd be very, very difficult to estimate. I can only guess. I would say that, you know, I have a particular theory that amongst doctors, probably only medical doctors, probably only about 10% of them are really very good at what they do, and I think we could say the same for attorneys and auto mechanics. And I think we have to assume that that's probably true about every discipline. I'm not saying that 90% of them are unethical, but when you take on in the unethical, the incompetent, and the snake oil salesman and all this, you put it all together, I think in almost any field, you know, you're going to find that probably only about 10% of them actually end up being very good at what they say they can do.
I got to take a break. Well, you got a final comment?
I would really disagree with that. I think most of your MDs are responsible and ethical. Maybe only a few % are frauds. But John Townley, he's a respected U.S. astrologer with 20 years experience. He says this, quote, I would say that most of the accusers of astrology are probably correct. They think that astrologers are 100% charlatans, but I would bring it down to 90%. In other words, he's saying 90% of astrologers are charlatans. Your chance of getting a charlatan are 9 out of 10.
Yes, I'd like to ask you two how you explain the diversity of personalities and destinies among twins.
Yeah. That's a very good question. Do you want me to take it?
Well, go ahead and I'll finish.
Okay. Well, I assume, of course, you're probably speaking of identical twins in this particular case. We do know that in the case of very close identical twins that there are often amazingly close parallels. For example, there's often a higher degree of ability for them to have some sort of intercommunication on the mind level, to know what the other one's going to say, or to speak. In some rare cases, they can even speak the same words at the same moment, indicating that there's some sort of a link between them when they're very close. But in addition to that, you'll often see things where they live 1,000 miles apart, but on the same day, unknown to each other, they met the woman that they were going to marry, and her first name was exactly the same name. So there are some unusual correspondences that I think that perhaps are accounted for by the similarity in their birth times, but can't really be explained in a scientific sense as yet. You know, and I think that the psychologists want very much to understand that.
Let me ask you a question. How then could you, as an astrologer that wants to test it scientifically, how could you devise a test with what you just told me? Because what you're saying is, yeah, they're close to being the same, but really when you get down to testing it, there's too many variables and just a few minutes makes too much difference. You couldn't test it then.
Well, if you could get a case where there's only 2 minutes apart in birth time, the Earth wouldn't have rotated that much. There would be very little difference. The charts would be almost identical. So you could, that would be a pretty good test. Those births, okay, are extremely rare. So the average astrologer wouldn't have access to that kind of data more than once or so in his lifetime. What's difficult about identical twins is it's difficult to get enough data to do a test. That's the real problem.
John, a good test for that would be to have a baby born, 2 babies in the same hospital born at the same time.
What I found, I haven't done thousands, but I've done many. I found that identical twins, if they're truly identical, are polar opposites in many, many ways. They're so close that what you do, what I do, is I take the birth chart of one and I actually invert it and make it the polar opposite. And the parents to whom I read the chart, to whom I've read these charts, are astounded because identical twins are not identical. Yes, they do say the same thing at the same time, and their lives do parallel, absolutely. But because of the, and when you actually just take one and make it the polar opposite, you actually invert the chart, you're able to read them. And that's what you do in the case, that's what I do in the case.
Can I throw out, well, Karen, I'd like a comment from you. What do you think?
Well, it's just having 4 children myself and having helped raise a number of children, and, you know, having dealt with a couple of cases of twins, but also children who are close to each other in the same family, I think it's a psychological phenomena, you know, what you interpret astrologically, that if people are close, they are going to, one of them is going to assume the polar opposite position of the other. That's survival. You know, you got an aggressive, assertive person, his counterpart who's close to him emotionally, physically, a sibling or whatever, is going to reverse that. And, you know, it need not be in his chart. You may have to manipulate the chart in order to find a reading that would suit that phenomena, but I think it's a fairly common phenomena that you see.
I have a suggestion. There's the only man that I know that's an expert on this is a man man named Spencer Grendel out of Los Angeles. He has a master's in psychology from Harvard, and he has studied this with as many cases as he could get. Now, the number of cases are probably only about 75, which doesn't constitute a legitimate statistical study, but that's a larger number of cases. And of course, he feels essentially the same way. I would agree, except to say that psychology and astrology are in fact the very same thing. So if you see psychological traits, they should be apparent in some way in the chart. And if I didn't believe that, it'd be very easy for me to back out of this. I think that's a very good test of astrology.
Do you think really that psychologists would agree with you that psychology and astrology are the same thing?
I think I've got a quote laying here on the floor from Carl Jung that astrology is a more supreme system of psychology than anything else that psychology's devised, and he is considered about the most formidable voice.
Let me just say in response to that, you know, that it should be, yes, if astrology is valid, there should be that indication, but we have a situation where the birth chart is the same or similar. Maxine is saying she on her own initiation is switching these things around to get a valid reading. The reading that you get from setting up these two charts, which are either exactly the same or just a few minutes off, maybe different ascendant, whatever, but basically the same, is not valid because you have the behavior, polar opposite behavior of two siblings, and that is not coming out of the chart. She has to manipulate the chart by turning it around because that's the way she feels, you know, she can read this.
That's one technique, but the reason I recommended Mr. Spencer Grendel is because he has another technique which does not manipulate the chart or turn it around, which accounts for very fine differences where they're less than 2 minutes. And his technique, I've seen him present that case, and it's a fairly, he said, I don't claim to say that this works in 100% of the cases, but it's fairly convincing, probably 85–90% of the cases. The technique that he suggests seems to work very well when we apply it to adult twins less than 2 minutes apart who have, you know, lived 20, 30, 40 years, so you can see considerable personality differences between them.
Terry, the skeptic of astrology would say what you've just said and all of that is you don't need astrology to explain what you just said.
Oh, I think you do, because I think what we're talking about is although the twins are very different, there are 1,000 ways you can be opposite from each other. The point is sometimes not understanding what's opposite there, but what is really the content of their character. I mean, if one is aggressive and the other is passive, that's one way to be opposite. If one is an athlete and the other one is a very intellectual type, that's another way of being opposite. But it's very important to know whether you're looking at an athletic or an intellectual or an aggressive, or, as I think one of the interesting cases where two gentlemen that are born less than 2 minutes apart, where one has chosen a life of homosexuality and the other one is heterosexual.
Dr. Willen?
Yeah, I'd like to comment on the interpretation of a chart. It's first of all, it's entirely subjective. In our The Facts on Astrology book, we state at least 7 independent studies have indicated that even with the best astrologers, there is little agreement as to the meaning of a chart. 7 additional studies revealed that people who have horoscopes interpreted for them cannot tell the difference between a right chart and a wrong chart, and even astrologers, professional astrologers, cannot tell the difference between a chart that is supposedly true and entirely reversed. And the chairman of the United Kingdom Astrological Association here is describing a person who is very meek, but astrology predicts should be aggressive. And he shows the problems you get into as an astrologer trying to interpret these, you know, up to thousands of different variables. He says this, and he's criticizing astrologers. He says, if I found a very meek and unaggressive person with 5 planets in Aries, this does not cause me to doubt that Aries means aggression. I may be able to point to his Pisces ascendant, or to his Sun conjunct Saturn, or to his ruler in the 12th house, and if none of these alibis are available, I can simply say that he has not yet fulfilled his Aries potential. Or I can argue, as I have heard argued, that if a person has an excess of planets in a particular sign, he will tend to suppress the characteristics of that sign because he is scared that if he reveals them, he will carry them to excess. But if on the next day I meet a very aggressive person who also has 5 planets in Aries, I will change my tune. I will say he had to be like that because of his planets in Aries. The point is, as one of my instructors at the conference said, take any astrological indication you want. It can mean anything I darn well want it to mean.
Karen, maybe I could come to you. When you were actually giving advice as a professional astrologer in Chicago for 12 years, did you give out any morality with your astrology advice?
No suggestions or morality that was based on anything that I considered or led my client to believe was objective. my own preferences, when asked, as Maxine suggested, I did share with them. I did advise certain lines of action, but not, very much off the record to the client, not based on deterministic things that I saw in the chart, and not based on any moral objectivity, but just on my own preferences or how I saw the situation unfolding.
Dr. Martin, what do you think about that? What is the difference between astrology and Christianity right there?
Well, the difference is that in Christianity and in the biblical revelation, God speaks with authority and with certainty, and he calls men to repentance. There is a need for a change in the life, a change in the mind. In Christianity, there is the forgiveness of sin, the dealing with the problem of sin. There's also proven authority. Jesus said, "You destroy this body, and in 3 days I will raise it up." If he didn't come back from the dead, as he said, his disciples would have been the first to disbelieve in him. So would the apostles. In Christianity, you have guidance. The Holy Spirit, not the stars, gives you guidance. It's the power of God adopting us into his family rather than aborting us into the occult. And I think Christianity must give us the assurance of the future, which astrology can't. Christianity says, "I will come again and receive you unto myself, that where I am, you may be also." And astrology can't talk in theological terms, in moral terms, or in ethical terms. That's why so many people are swept into it, because it really doesn't speak to the great underlying problem, which is the curse of mankind, which is sin, transgression of God's law, and the need for a relationship to God, which the gospel says is through repentance and faith in the Lord Jesus Christ.
Right. I think the need that it speaks to or purports to speak to is metaphysical ignorance. You're having problems with your spouse, your personal cycle's out of sync with the cosmic cycle. Go see an astrologer, he'll set you up, everything's going to be okay. There's, you have to achieve a certain level of understanding in order to solve this problem. No indication that there may be something in your action and your attitude that is sinful, and by sinful I'm talking the biblical definition of the word. It's rebellious against God and his plan for human beings, which is outlined in this book, and it is bad for the person. It is destructive of the person. There's no indication of that, because there is no sin in this worldview, and it's a worldview, it's a philosophy bordering on religion. The real need, the underlying need that we all have, is for forgiveness, and this is what Jesus Christ came to offer us. Only if we accept the fact he is the sole provision, the only provision that God has made for us to get back into a right relationship with him. This world is full of seekers, people who are looking for God, to get back to God, for union with God, a unit of consciousness, harmony, harmonic convergence, the whole bit. They want their relationship with God restored. They want fellowship with God. This is what we were created for. And the only way we can get it, says this book, is by coming to the Lord Jesus Christ and by admitting that we have sinned. Not that we're ignorant, not that we don't have all our metaphysical facts straight, that we have sinned against him and against each other, asking his forgiveness and trusting that he has set the thing right and will get us back to that relationship. I have never heard an astrologer in 12 years of practice, and I never did as I was an astrologer, I have never heard an astrologer lead a person to that point.
Maxine, you said you're a Christian. In this thing of guilt, everybody's got guilt. As a Christian and as an astrologer, have you ever told somebody that the way they get rid of their guilt is to come to Jesus Christ, since you want God's plan for their life?
Yes.
Have you actually led people to the Lord?
You just asked me a question. I just said yes.
I want to know, how did it go?
Exactly as you said. When somebody is there...
Did you explain to them the fact is that the basis of their problem is the sin, and the fact is that the way that can be relieved...
I'm not a Christian theologian. What I tell people when I give them a reading is that this horoscope is God's plan for their life, and that there is a time to plant, a time to sow, and a time to reap. When they're having a difficulty, they are out of sync with God's plan for them, and God's plan for them is indicated in the horoscope. I talk to them. I ask them what their religious background is, because a lot of people are not Christian. As we've seen, we have scientists, we have Jews, we have Catholics, and so what I do is I talk to them about God. I don't talk to them if they're Jewish about Jesus Christ because they're not necessarily open to that. But I do speak of God. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Dr. Martin?
Yeah, what bothers me is, in dealing with astrology, particularly with Maxine in this, is I asked her a specific question in one of the earlier programs. Who is Jesus Christ, if you recall the dialogue? And I said, is he God in human flesh? Yes. But Maxine in Vegas said, who we are, that's her too, is God in an earthbound body. And to the audience in her class she said, quote, you are God. Why not create? Close quote. You see, what you get in astrology and what you get from occultism is a type of theological double talk in which you can say, yes, Jesus is God, but I am too. You are too. The worldview differs. We can use the same vocabulary, but the meanings are totally different. It's very important to understand that when you're talking with astrologers and people in the world of the occult and the cults, you've got to define your terms because they are masters at imitating the vocabulary of theology with all the meanings changed, as we saw just a few minutes ago.
Dr. Welland, you have a comment?
I think we're dealing with worldview confusion. Astrology, in essence, is a pantheistic system. There is no logical basis for morality in it. There's no logical basis for the acknowledgement of sin or the need for repentance. Christianity is just the opposite. It says we're created by God, that God is the one who we are to look to, not to creation, and that the only way by which we can be forgiven of our sins and escape eternal judgment in hell is by believing in Christ as our personal Savior. That is the bottom line issue. Astrology will lead someone away from a personal relationship with God and Christ, and insofar as it does that, it leads them into eternal judgment.
Karen, when you were in it, you actually, as a professional astrologer, you started to recognize that you yourself, as an astrologer, were not obeying any kind of morality. You were just kind of punting. What changed that?
Well, at the end of the 12 years, well, let me just throw in here also the last 5 years that I was involved through the channeling. I was led from the astrology into the channeling. The channeling had two parts. The first part was a lot of information that was very occultic, that the details of which led me to a point where I could fully accept when I heard the bizarre teachings of Church Universal and Triumphant, the teachings of the Ascended Masters through the tradition of the Theosophical Institute and now Elizabeth Clare Prophet, that I could fully accept those because of the content of this channeling. The second part of the channeling was quite a bit of material on subatomic physics, and I mean, my last grade in science was a C in college biology. Who am I kidding, you know? This stuff was not for me, and I knew it.
The spirit that you channeled was giving you information on subatomic physics?
The physics of consciousness, and subatomic physics, and biofeedback, and brain waves, and
how do you know it was
the
any good?
structure of light. Because through a kind of happenstance, I stumbled onto a group from a leading university in the Chicago area, professionals, New Age professionals. There was a psychiatrist who was a medical doctor, psychologist who was doing research in biofeedback and brainwaves, a very well-known parapsychologist who worked with the astronauts in the 60s, few graduate students, and a physicist. And this group of people worked with me on this material. They hypnotized me. They got more of it. I answered questions for them on their research, which I had no idea what the heck they were doing or, you know, where it was coming from. They were insisting that, you know, Karen, you are just another Jane Roberts. Boy, this is great. You know, we can all do this. We can all channel. Well, channeling was not the word. You've opened up into your higher consciousness, and it just goes to show you that all the knowledge in heaven and on earth is ours. We are God's evolving, you know, and you have taken a major step forward. My occultic friends, you know, the more backward, candid of my friends, said, you know, somebody has stumbled into you, and you got to decide how you're going to use this entity or be used by it. And I didn't like that view. I like the very flattering, fashionable view that's common today, that we're channeling these spirit guides and they're really telling us, you know, they're wonderful and they're really telling us how to live our lives. At the end of that, the channeling was cut short when I was introduced to an entity who then said he was actually 30 individuals on the mental plane, and they were involved in interdimensional cybernetic research, and they wanted me to join their team. I mean, I was impressed. You know, little old me, they want to join their team. Where do I sign up?
So this spirit asked you to join the
yes.
team. What'd you say?
Right. Well, I said, no, you know, I had something on straight here. I said, well, what are the drawbacks here? What am I risking? And he said, well, you know, the Lord had a gun to his head, I'm sure, because he told the truth. He said, well, you know, you may scramble your code. You may lose your magnetic moorings. You may come back in a different vehicle than the one in which you started out in, different body. People may not recognize you. So I said, well, you know, this is a significant drawback. But he said, now every time you walk out the door, you risk you're going to be hit by a car. You know, it's probably safer than a plane ride. So I said, okay, where do I sign up? That was the end of the channeling. The door was closed. I could make no more contact. It was over. All I had left was Church Universal and Triumphant. And I was, you know, pointed in that direction by one of the guys that I was channeling. So after 5 years with them, the whole notion that I was becoming God seemed to fall apart. Suddenly, I saw myself in a different way. I mean, I must have entered an alternate worldview, you know. I saw myself in a different way, and I said, you know, that worm that's out in the yard there, he is not evolving into me, and I am not evolving into God, because I saw my relationships with my husband and children, my finances and financial relationships I was involved in, my business, my friends, and I knew that I was involved in many webs of deception. I was not having affairs, and I was not robbing banks. But there was no reason I could come up with not to do those things, other than personal preference. And I knew that. I faced that. I faced the fact that my life was relatively in a shambles. I could not be becoming God. This is ridiculous. And I fell apart for 2 weeks. I was depressed, and I was anxious, and I felt this was the end. There was no more meaning. I had used up every alternative to Jesus Christ, and I had dumped him a long time ago and thought that he was a figment of my adolescent imagination, lucky to outgrow him, growing up in the cosmos. And the Lord brought to mind some scripture verses for me to deal with at that time. Acts 4:12, there's no other name given under heaven by which men must be saved. This was new news to me again. And, Revelation 3:20, behold, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and answers that door, I will come in and dine with him and he with me. And I knew, I mean, right there it was as though my dead grandmother had appeared at the window, knocking on the window. That's me. No. I knew that Jesus Christ was alive and real, and that relationship was there. There was a door between us, but he was back. And I just had my hand on that door, and I'm dancing around, you know, I wanted to open this door, but there was one impediment in the way. I said, I have got a library back there that won't quit. And so I said, Lord, is there a way? You know, I said, I picked up this book, not this one, but it was a different one. I said, Lord, forgive me for using this book this way, because I've been working with the I Ching, and I'm rusty on the Bible. But I said, if you can still speak to me through this book, please do it now, because I am desperate. I'm at my end. And I said, I want to know from you what your evaluation is of this baggage, of theories of reincarnation, of all that I have ever done or been involved in astrology, of my beloved ascended masters to whom I have had altars in my home. And I opened it up as I would the I Ching. My eye fell on Mark 9:29. This kind can only be cast out by prayer and fasting. Okay, well, you know, I thought we could discuss this, but I could see that you know, this was a very curt answer to my prayer, and it was something I had to deal with. And I was re-immersing myself in his word. Every need that I have had, every idea and thought that I thought was important, I could see in retrospect at that point was a counterfeit of the original. This stuff is the original. This is the Holy Spirit, and a spirit guide is the counterfeit, and your higher self is a counterfeit. This is the original. We're talking about sin and my own need for repentance and for coming to be right with God through the Lord Jesus Christ. So by the time I went back, you know, to deal with it, I was more than happy to donate it to the Christian Research Institute.
All right, I need a wrap-up statement from each one of you here because we're out of time.
Astrology and Christianity are totally compatible. Astrology is the study of the relationship between God and man. As an astrologer, I put God first. And when I read the horoscope, I see God's handwriting for this person, God's plan for their life, God's plan for their soul. It is my honor. It is my joy. It is my love to be an astrologer, to be a Christian astrologer, and to practice astrology by putting God first.
Dr. Weldon?
I would say three things. Number one, that astrology, to begin with, is not scientific. All the scientific evidence disproves that it could be considered a science, in spite of many astrologers claim that it is science. Second, it is an occult practice, and that the occult is dangerous. It's consequential. It takes a person away from the true God and the true Jesus Christ. And third, I would say that astrology not only is not true, it cannot be true, because there are so many contradictory theories that you find in it. It is not something that will lead someone to to fulfillment, either in this life, in a sense of finding ultimate values, or in the next life. It doesn't offer the hope of eternal life that Christ offers. There is no such thing as a Christian astrologer, just as there is no such thing as a Christian Marxist or a Christian atheist.
Terry?
Well, first of all, I think it's important to realize that, and I think if I'm sort of quoting here, that Christianity is a religion of the heart. And I think there's a passage where Christ says, "Thank you, Father, for bringing this message to the men of heart rather than the men of mind." And I think clearly astrology as a science, and I do believe it, and I think that can be supported by the fact that almost every great scientist of antiquity has been an astrologer, and admittedly so in their own words. I think that we have to realize that it is a discipline of the mind, and it's not a morality-based system. Every day, scientists are very intent about not making moral judgments and things of this type. So we are not a religion as I see it, and we think that that's something for everyone to find on their own particular religious and philosophical beliefs they must find on their own. And I don't think it's incompatible, though, for someone who is a meteorologist or a geologist or an astronomer or an astrologer or anybody that uses that particular type of technique to understand more about life. I don't think that this automatically strips them of any morality, and I don't think that this is something that they can't study on their own in the privates of their own conscience. But I don't think that there's any particular place for it within the practice of a scientific discipline.
Dr. Martin?
God said that you could be a good astronomer, you could be a good physicist, you could be a good chemist, and he never made any prohibitions against it. When it got to astrology, he cursed it. And he said, don't do this, don't do this. Maxine says she loves him. If you love me, Jesus said, obey my commands. And he said the scriptures cannot be broken. The Old Testament is the Word of God. Christ endorsed the Old Testament. The Old Testament was fulfilled in the Lord Jesus Christ. Christians, taking the Bible seriously, will wend their way through all the double talk and get down to the basic fact that if God said don't do something, and another voice comes and says, did God say that? Take a bite of the fruit. I've always been suspicious of talking snakes, and astrology fits the category perfectly from a biblical perspective. So if you want to be an astrologer and you want to believe those things, well and good. But in the name of reason, common sense, and logic, never mind biblical theology, don't try and make it compatible with Christianity, because it's the direct opposite.
Folks, I want to say thank you to each one of you for coming tonight and for your participation in this. And for all of you that are listening, I hope that this was helpful to you. Good night. See you next week.